episode of the Food Production Podcast. This is episode 62, April 10th, 2013. And this is part 2 of Permaculture Design. And today I was going to talk about designing for catastrophe, and I also wanted to talk about some broad concepts to understand in permaculture design. So in part 1, we defined permaculture. We talked about the ethics guiding permaculture. We talked about observing and making some maps based on those observations. And we made some really general observations. And the maps that we made were our wind and sun maps. And we made our, the sun and shade, water flows, and so those are the maps that we start out with. So when we talk about some broad concepts in permaculture design, one of the big ones is designing for catastrophe. And you want your design to lessen the chance of a fire, flood, or hurricane destroying your home and landscape. So if you think about it, permaculture is a sustainable design system. And if your design gets wiped out by some sort of catastrophe fairly easily, then how sustainable is it really? So you do have to think about the local catastrophes in your area and try to design to mitigate those issues. So as gardeners and designers, we can include certain elements in our design to lessen the impact of these disasters. I actually looked up major disaster declarations in Pennsylvania on the FEMA website, and I actually was surprised at the amount of disasters that seem to be occurring much more frequently than in the past. So, in my opinion, this makes it even more important to design resilient, disaster-proof gardens and farms today than it was, say, 50 years ago. For example, from 1994 to 2012 in Pennsylvania, there were 25 disaster declarations in 18 years. From 1955 to 1993, there were 22 disaster declarations in 38 years. So over double the year span and 3 less disasters. So it seems to me that these disasters are speeding up, which makes our permaculture design and the resiliency that much more important. So the most likely environmental catastrophes in my area were severe storms was the number 1 thing. Flooding was number 2. Severe winter storms was number 3. And hurricanes, believe it or not, even though we're inland, was number 4. Although I question how many hurricanes we're getting in here. Although we do occasionally get some tornadoes. But maybe that's more by the coast. So the big thing for me is going to be severe storms and flooding. So what are we talking about? We're talking about wind and we're talking about water. So we've already talked about both those things. So if we can find a way to use the water the way we want it to use it, have productive places for it to go, and we have good windbreaks in place to protect our structure, then we're going to be in a much better position to deal with these catastrophes. If we build a structure, for example, my house is built with insulated concrete form walls. So if we get serious wind, this house isn't going anywhere. But I'd like to augment that with some smartly placed windbreaks. So some of the design elements to consider to reduce the impact of disaster. We already talked about windbreaks. But also swales and berms to enhance water holding capabilities. Ponds, obviously, also to enhance water holding capabilities. A good pitch roof, if you're in an area that gets a lot of snow and rain, to shed that snow and rain. Using heavy materials in construction, stuff like I said before, concrete formed walls, metal roofs. If you do get a really good metal roof that's attached properly, it's definitely a more of a long-term proposition than shingles. You're not going to have the metal blowing off like you would shingles blowing off. Certain species of trees like mulberries, oaks, poplars, willows, maples. Those are trees that are actually fire resistant. So you can plant these fairly densely with some succulent ground covers and shrubs, and they can form a pretty dense fire break. So you plant these, around the house, and they can be a nice fire break. Obviously, also water, ponds and things like that around the house can also provide really, really nice fire breaks. Another major concept of permaculture, and one that you want to use in your design, is mimicking nature. Mother Nature she's the permaculture designer that we all aspire to be like. So she's the most intelligent landscape designer and architect. Anytime we can copy her in form and function, I think we're definitely on the right track. I'm going to give you a quote from Toby Hemingway. He says that an ecological garden both looks and works the way nature does. It does this by building strong connections among the plants, soil life, beneficial insects, and other animals, and the gardener to weave a resilient, natural webwork. I think that's a great quote. So that gives you an idea of sort of what I'm talking about when we're saying that we want to mimic nature. Another big concept to include in your design, actually it's not really a concept, but I think it's something that you need to really understand, because as you're setting up your permaculture system, you might be apt to stop things that should be happening in your permaculture system if you don't understand succession. So succession is a really important concept to understand when you're doing this stuff. A manicured monocrop lawn, with neatly pruned shrubs and trees planted, only for looks, availability, and with a nice mulch layer free from any weeds, lacking in creativity. This idea of what some people think of as the neat manicured look. It's the antithesis of nature. It's the opposite of permaculture, and it's considered to be, by permaculture standards, a very immature landscape. Throughout a lot of the Midwest, Mother Nature, she wants to build prairies. So if you're in the Midwest and you just don't do anything, you're going to have a prairie, for the most part. If you're in the Northeast or the Mid-Atlantic, she's going to want to build forests. So if you don't do anything, eventually you'll have a forest after 30, 40, 50 years. So in these areas, and it's a lot of the United States is meant to be forests. So unless an area is a desert, she'll never stop building these forests. It doesn't matter how many times you cut the grass, it will continue to grow. Something will continue to grow back. It doesn't matter how many times you weed, weeds will keep coming back. So if you stopped maintaining your lawn and landscape and just let everything go, like I said before, 30 to 50 years from now, you'd have a forest again. And what happens during that time between that immature landscape when you stopped maintaining it to the point where 50 years later you have a forest, that's succession. That time between is succession. And to give you an example of how it happens and what happens, let's take the example of a barren, damaged site that was cleared of all the greenery and then left to fend for itself. First, to colonize an area the first thing that comes in will be the annual weeds. And these weeds bring in valuable nutrients to the surface. They'll have the deep tap roots that are going to pull these nutrients up to the surface. They're typically very fast growing, so they've got the biomass that's going to help to restore the humus layer of the damaged land. So after the annual weeds take over, then you'll have some perennial weeds coming in, and they're going to be taller than the annuals, and they'll start to take over from the annuals. And you'll still have some annuals mixed in, but the perennials will start to dominate. And then you'll start to have some shrubs and vines come in, followed by, after that, you'll start having some short-lived, fast-growing, smaller trees. And in the end, after many, many decades, you're back to native forest. So you'll have that upper canopy, you'll have that lower canopy, you'll have that vine layer, you'll have the shrub layer, you'll have the herbaceous layer, you'll have the root layer. So you'll have all these, all the 7 layers of the forest at some point. So these land healers and soil builders, all these plants that build up the soil and build up the land enough to support a native forest. I mean, you can't just grow a forest on damaged property and land. I mean, it takes a long time for that to fix itself. And nature fixes it for you. And it fixes it with certain plants and what we would call quote-unquote weeds. And a lot of times these quote-unquote weeds are also what the government would call invasive species. Oh, these horrible invasive species, we've got to get rid of them. and and we wonder why we never can get rid of them, because they're trying to build forest. So these pioneer species they're basically very, very hardy plants that are going to be the first to colonize this barren, disturbed, damaged land. And we can use these pioneer species, in our designs to try to mimic nature, to try to bring up our food forests. And we can use them as nurse plants, we can use them as nutrient accumulators, biomass accumulators, mulch plants, nitrogen fixers. So these are important plants to know and understand how they work. And a lot of permaculturists will, if you're installing a food forest, they might install, they might install 20, 30 fruit trees, but then they might install 75 nitrogen fixing trees. And as the nitrogen fixing trees grow up to a certain point, they might coppice them. When I say coppice, that means you basically cut off, the top of it. So they might cut the top, they might cut the tree in half. So they might make it. I saw a video with Jeff Lawton, and he was going through and coppicing these nitrogen fixing trees, and he would cut them off at about head height, and they were approximately 10 to 15 feet tall, and he'd just come in. They were still pretty skinny, so it was pretty easy to cut them. He'd come in and cut the top off and basically use them as mulch. And when you cut the top off of a tree like that, a nitrogen fixing tree, the roots shed in the soil and releases all sorts of nitrogen in the soil. So that enhances all the trees around it. So that's how you can use nature to build your soil and to restart a food forest and give you those mature soils. But that's what nature really wants to be. So if you have an area that's disturbed and there's and you just want to, and let's say you cleared an area out, something's going to come in there and grow. It's up to you whether you want it to be something you choose or something Mother Nature chooses. But if it's something you choose, you're going to be much better off if you're choosing something that's in line with Mother Nature's principles and succession principles. And you know what? And if you get some weeds in there, realize what those weeds are and think about whether or not they're helping your system out. So don't just be so insane about removing every single one of these weeds. It doesn't necessarily mean that just because you have these weeds that there's something wrong with your system that you're setting up. So we need to start to learn to observe nature and start to understand succession, how it works, and how to use it to our benefit. And we try to work with nature, not against, which is a pretty common permaculture ideal. The last big concept I wanted to discuss today was patterns in design. And we should be designing our permaculture designs from patterns to details. And that's pretty common too. So we start with very large abstract concepts of patterns, and we start from patterns down to details. And that's going to give us a better overview. I don't know if you've ever seen, and I've seen this a lot with people doing their own landscapes at home. And a lot of times what they do is they go out to the nursery, they grab a plant, they buy a couple plants, and then they just stick them in places that they think looks nice in that little detailed area. But then you step back and look at their property, and they've been doing this for years, where they go out and buy a few plants and stick one here and stick one there. You step back and look at their property, and there's no rhyme or reason to their design. It looks terrible. It's completely against nature. It's not productive at all. And they always wonder why are things not turning out the way I wanted. I bought all these pretty plants and put them in the ground, and it just doesn't look right. We need to start thinking about the property as a whole and designing and using natural patterns in nature, and then working down to the details. So at this point in your design process, we're still thinking broad concepts, and we're going to start understanding these patterns. And once you understand the patterns and some of the patterns in nature, you can start mimicking nature, like we talked about in the last part of this podcast. So permaculture design works to copy these patterns and shapes that occur in nature. And these patterns will tend to enhance energy flow or slow it down, and that's going to depend on the needs of the design or the inhabitants. So you can pick there's certain patterns that will speed up energy flows if you wanted to, or certain patterns that are going to slow it down if you wanted to. This also adds to the diversity of life, adds to edge. We'll talk about edge in a little bit, which is really important. Let's go over some of the common designs, or some of the common patterns in nature. Wave patterns are very, very common in nature, and something we can definitely mimic in our designs. And for example, something that you've seen, radio waves, or if you've ever seen, really long grass or really long corn stalks with some wind blowing along the grass, and you'll see those waves. Those are wave patterns. And with design use, if we're using a wave pattern, it increases your edge, which increases the diversity and productivity of your design. So your edge is, for example, if you made a circle, but then if you made a wavy circle, that wavy circle is going to have a lot more of an edge line, a lot more of that barrier between whatever it is on the one side of the line and the other side of the line is going to be much more. And your edges are going to be much more productive than any other place in your garden. So the edges of the forest to the pasture, the edges of your pond to the pasture, these edges are going to be where you have all sorts of nutrient and energy flow and lots of connections, and you're going to have areas where you can grow the most amount of productivity. And so if you can, that's the nice thing about using some of these different edges. If you just use straight lines, you're not going to have as much edge as if you use a wavy line. And a wavy line is going to give you that additional edge, additional productivity, additional diversity, and it's also going to look nicer. Let's see. Streamlines. That's another interesting one. If you think about like a car as it moves through the air, it has that streamline effect. And you can use streamlines to encourage, the diversity of species. And streamlines are really just another way of saying edge. And streamlines or edge is where you're going to get all those different microclimates like we just talked about. Let's see, cloud forms. This is kind of a good one. An example would be like smoke from your chimney. And cloud forms tend to involve the collection and dispersal. For example, actual clouds are formed by, evaporation of water and rising air currents, where the water vapor condenses to form cloud water, and then so the cloud forms will involve collection of the water and then dispersal of the water. So design use for our cloud forms can be a little bit different than waves in that they're not exactly where a wave is going to be sort of repeating. A cloud form is more irregular, so it's going to give us that increased edge and that increased planting area, but it's going to be more irregular than your wave forms. Spirals. This is a really good one. They increase and enhance and capture the flow of energy for a lot longer time than a straight line would. For example, an example in nature would be like a DNA helix or seashells, ram's horns. That would be a really good one. For design use, herb spirals, obviously, that's the obvious one. And the nice thing about the spiral in this design is it gives you a diversity of climate and water in a very compact area. And spirals can also have less path area than straight lines. So definitely spirals, and they look really cool once you get some spirals into your design. Lobes, that's another interesting one. And lobes tend to hold energy in a circular type pattern. For example, a neighborhood cul-de-sac is a lobe. In design use, a basic lobe design would be like a keyhole bed or a mandala garden, which allows for mandala gardens and keyhole beds allow for a lot less path space and more planting space. So that's the nice thing about lobes. Branches are also an interesting one, and branches are a way of connecting and dispersing energy, food, and materials in the most efficient pattern. I mean, think about the branches of a tree, or even more down to more detail. Take a leaf, and you can see the branching pattern. You'll have kind of a thicker you'll kind of have a little thicker vein down the middle, and then these branching out from the branching pattern. So the classic branching on the leaf allows for the main vein to disperse nutrients to the entire leaf efficiently without taking up too much space. And we can mimic that by allowing for more planting space and less path space, and also the diversity of the paths. So one thing that I did in my design was, I used the idea of the branching, with my lobe pattern. So I used a keyhole bed setup, and I had a main vein. The main vein of my keyhole bed setup was a 3-foot wide vein to access each of the keyholes. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to easily be able to get my wheelbarrow down the main vein. And then when it goes up into the keyhole setup, I shrunk the pathway down to 2 foot, so it's just a walking path. So I use that same concept. The smaller veins, they're just for footpath. The wider vein down the middle is going to be for my wheelbarrow. So that's one way that you could certainly mimic nature. Scatter. This is an interesting one. I'm not sure. There are definitely ways you can use this. I'm not sure how I'm going to use this, or if I'm going to use this in my design. But in the scatter pattern, there's a cluster of material basically radiating out and more or less trying to gain a foothold at the edges to create more clusters. For example, an insect outbreak on a farm. If there'll be a cluster of heavy insect predation, and they'll sort of scatter out from there. So if you're going to use it in a design, I guess one good way to use it would be if you're looking to spread a species via seed, and you want the plant to self-seed. So let's say you've got a self-seeding, a very aggressive self-seeding annual that you want to populate an area. And one way to do that would be to not necessarily worry about seeding the whole area, but seed an area and then place it so it's downwind from the area that you also want it to populate. And then chances are you might be able to get it to populate. That's one way you could use the scatter technique, or basically mimic the scatter technique in nature. Let's see, nets. Nets are also a really good one. Basically, this is where you have individual cells put together in a net, and it greatly increases the strength of the entire pattern. For example, like a spider web. And another way to use this in a design would be to connect, let's say you have an orchard and you want to connect your trees via trench network. And then basically when it rains, so what you do is you have like a depressed area around the root ball of each tree, and then you have almost like a depressed sort of trench connecting all the trees. So you have this sort of trench network. So it rains, water goes in amongst all the trenches and feeds all the trees. So some of the drier climates, they'll use this, and that's actually called a net and pan drainage system. And that's actually kind of a cool concept. I actually thought about doing that in my design, but ultimately I couldn't figure out a really simple way to make that work. And I thought of different things, using a tamper to really tamp the area down, between the trees. And I just went with the swales. I felt that was a better way to go. We do get a fair amount of water here, and I was looking to also get some more of the nutrients that the swales provide, or the bioswales provide. So the last thing I was going to talk about, I'm sorry, the patterns were not the last thing. This is the last thing. Last thing I was going to talk about was another big thing to think about, which is mapping your contour lines. I know we've already discussed this a little bit, but this is really, really important. I want to discuss it a little bit more in depth. And this should be added to your observation maps. So at this point, you should have a wind map, a water map, sun and shade map with your solar aspect, and then now you need to make a contour map. One good kind of cool thing about contour lines is you can actually, I'm not sure if you can do this via Google Earth. I used Google Earth to sort of get an idea of the drop off of my slope, trying to figure out how quickly my slope is dropping off. I actually use Google Earth for that, and that actually worked really well. It actually tells you the height at different points on your property. So I would highly recommend Google Earth to help you with that. But I actually went out and did my contour map with an A-frame level, and I actually went through and did it with an A-frame level. If I could do it over, I definitely would have used a laser level, because that would have been a lot quicker. I mean, it was pretty... Using the A-frame level, I spent like a couple days doing it, and it was way too much labor for that. So if I could do it over, I would definitely use a laser level. So what's the point of contour lines? Basically, your contour lines it's gonna help you, because your water is gonna run 90 degrees to contour. So if you can put things on your contour lines, first of all, it's going to look a lot nicer. You're going to be much better at using your energy flows, and you're going to be much better at harvesting water. So when possible, you're going to want to try to put your fence lines on contour. That's going to be a much better place for them. You're going to want to try to put your bed lines. So if you've got your garden beds, a lot of times guys will use, or permaculturists will use contour garden lines. So they might make a double dig, or I'm sorry, not a double dig, a double reach garden bed on contour, and that actually works pretty well. That's something that Jeff Lawton used in his one of his videos. I don't remember which one, but he shows a pretty big aerial shot of a huge garden they have at that permaculture farm. It's a double reach garden bed on contour. So fence lines, bed lines, garden beds, swales. Obviously, you've got to put your swales on contour, otherwise they don't work. Pathways, another good thing to put on contour. So so when your contour map is done, you're going to start to see some natural patterns starting to emerge that are specific to your site, and this will help you to think about how to lay out your swales, pathways, fence lines, contour beds and contoured garden beds, things like that. So it's very, very important that you do a good contour map. And like I said before, I would highly recommend a laser level. So I'm going to stop. This is going to be it for part 2. I'm going to stop here, but I'll pick up next week with linking. I planned on getting to that today, but I'm starting. I think if I start linking and making positive connections and stacking functions, if I start that's a long segment, so I don't want to start that today. We'll start that next week. So thank you for listening to the Food Production Podcast.